Hollywood's golden age looked flawless on screen, icons like Marlon Brando and Bette Davis defined style, power, and perfection. But behind the lights, another reality existed. Night after night, Johnny Carson sat just inches away from these legends, witnessing what audiences never could. The smiles stayed perfect, the stories stayed polished, but the truth was far more complicated. This is the side of Hollywood no one talks about. Number 1. Richard Burton. There was a time when Richard Burton wasn't just admired, he was revered. With a voice carved from thunder and a presence that commanded silence, he represented intellect, power, and irresistible charm. Audiences saw a man of refinement, a performer who could turn even a simple sentence into something unforgettable. But what appeared effortless from a distance carried a very different weight up close. When Burton walked onto the set, everything seemed perfectly in place, tailored suits, composed posture, sharp wit ready at every moment. Yet the illusion began to fade the closer one sat to him. Beneath the polished exterior was a quiet intensity shaped by habits that had long crossed the line from indulgence into dependence. It wasn't something visible to the audience, but it was impossible to ignore for someone sitting just a few feet away. As conversations deepened, Burton had a tendency to lean forward, drawn into his own stories with theatrical passion. His energy filled the space, but so did something heavier, an overwhelming presence that hinted at long nights and excess hidden behind sophistication. Johnny Carson, ever the professional, never broke composure. He listened, nodded, even smiled at the right moments, but subtly adjusted his distance, creating space without drawing attention. What made it more difficult was Burton's brilliance. His thoughts were sharp, his humor effortless, his delivery captivating. Every word demanded attention, leaving no room to disengage. Carson had to remain fully present, balancing admiration with quiet endurance. The audience saw an engaging, intellectual exchange between two great personalities. What they didn't see was the silent discipline required to maintain that illusion. Richard Burton was a contradiction, elegance intertwined with excess, brilliance shadowed by personal battles. Number 2. Walter Matthau. Walter Matthau had a presence that felt instantly familiar, like someone the audience already trusted before he even spoke. His humor was effortless, his timing unmatched, and his personality carried a natural looseness that made every appearance feel unscripted and alive. On screen, he perfected the role of the disorganized, slightly cynical everyman. Off-screen, the line between character and reality was thinner than most people realized. When Matthau arrived on set, he often carried the energy of wherever he had just come from, rarely polished, never overly prepared, and completely uninterested in maintaining any kind of Hollywood illusion. His clothes looked lived in rather than styled. His posture relaxed to the point of carelessness. It wasn't neglect in a dramatic sense, but it reflected a man who simply didn't prioritize appearances the way others did. As the interview began, Matthau would quickly take control of the rhythm. His stories flowed naturally, filled with dry humor and sharp observations. He laughed loudly, leaned back, leaned forward, moved freely without concern for formality. That unpredictability made him entertaining, but it also made things difficult for the person sitting across from him. Johnny Carson genuinely enjoyed Matthau's company, which made the situation more complicated. Instead of distancing himself, Carson had to stay engaged. Reacting in real time to every joke, every sudden shift in tone. At moments, Matthau would lean in too close while laughing or emphasizing a point, breaking the invisible boundary that most guests naturally respected. Carson would subtly lean back or turn slightly, small adjustments hidden behind well-timed smiles. The audience saw pure chemistry, two men sharing jokes, building off each other's energy. It looked effortless, almost spontaneous. But behind that smooth exchange was constant awareness, a need to adapt without disrupting the flow. Number 3. Judy Garland. There was a time when Judy Garland represented pure magic. Her voice carried emotion that felt almost unreal, and her presence could light up an entire room without effort. To audiences, she was timeless, an icon whose talent seemed untouched by age or circumstance. But by the time she appeared in her later interviews, that image had begun to fracture in ways that couldn't be fully hidden. When Garland stepped onto the stage, the applause was still there, filled with admiration and nostalgia. But up close, the difference was impossible to ignore. Her movements felt heavier, her energy fragile, as if every step required more effort than it should. The brightness people remembered was still present, but it flickered. Struggling to stay alive under pressure, as the conversation began, she tried to hold on to that familiar charm. She smiled, told stories, even laughed at moments, but there was an underlying tension running through everything she did. Her voice, once effortlessly strong, now carried slight inconsistencies. Her thoughts drifted at times, as if maintaining focus itself had become a challenge. Johnny Carson immediately recognized the shift. This wasn't a situation where professionalism alone could carry the moment. It required something deeper: patience, sensitivity, and careful control of the conversation. Garland had a tendency to lean in close, seeking connection, sometimes reaching out physically in subtle, unconscious ways. Each time, Carson remained still, grounded, allowing her that space without making it uncomfortable. The audience saw an emotional, intimate interview. They saw vulnerability, honesty, even a sense of bravery. What they didn't fully see was the quiet effort it took to keep everything from falling apart. Carson had to guide the pace, gently redirect when needed, and hold the structure of the conversation together without making it obvious. Number 4. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando didn't just act, he changed what acting meant. His presence on screen felt raw, unpredictable, and completely real. He rejected polish, ignored expectations, and built a legacy on authenticity alone. To the audience, he was magnetic. To the industry, he was revolutionary. But that same rejection of convention didn't stop when the cameras turned off. When Brando appeared for interviews, there was always a sense that anything could happen. He didn't follow structure, didn't respect the usual rhythm of conversation, and rarely cared about presenting a controlled image. He spoke when he wanted, paused when he felt like it, and sometimes answered questions in ways that seemed deliberately indirect. It wasn't confusion, it was defiance. As he sat across from Johnny Carson, the dynamic immediately shifted. This wasn't a standard guest who would play along with the format. Brando leaned into silence, forcing Carson to fill gaps without losing control. At times, he would stare intensely before answering, creating tension that the audience interpreted as depth, but in reality, it disrupted the natural flow of the show. Physically, Brando ignored the usual boundaries most guests maintained. He leaned forward unexpectedly, shifted positions mid-conversation, and spoke with a level of closeness that made personal space almost irrelevant. Carson, trained to handle any situation, adapted in real time, subtly adjusting posture. Maintaining eye contact, and keeping the tone steady. What made it more challenging was Brando's unpredictability in tone. One moment he could be thoughtful and introspective, the next dismissive or sarcastic. Carson had to read each shift instantly, responding in a way that neither escalated tension nor broke the rhythm. It required constant awareness, every reaction carefully measured. The audience saw intensity. They saw a genius who refused to conform. Number 5. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was the kind of presence that never blended into the background. She arrived with energy already in motion, talking, gesturing, reacting, as if the interview had started long before the cameras began rolling. In Hollywood, she was known for her talent, her awards, and her fearless personality. But in a live setting, that same intensity created an environment that was anything but predictable. From the moment she stepped onto the set, there was no stillness. She spoke quickly, laughed loudly, and moved constantly, filling every second with expression. It wasn't rehearsed or controlled, it was instinctive. That made her fascinating to watch, but also difficult to contain within the structure of a formal interview. As she sat across from Johnny Carson, the usual rhythm of conversation changed completely. Questions didn't simply get answered, they became launch points for stories, memories, and sudden emotional shifts. Carson had to stay alert, following her pace rather than setting his own. Every attempt to guide the discussion gently required careful timing, because interrupting her flow wasn't easy without breaking the energy of the moment. Shelley Winters leaned into every story physically and emotionally. She would gesture widely, shift in her seat, and emphasize points with strong movements that made the space feel constantly active. There was no pause, no quiet transition, only momentum. Carson maintained his composure, but behind the smile, there was constant adjustment, timing responses, waiting for openings, and subtly regaining control when possible. What the audience experienced was pure entertainment. It looked spontaneous, lively, even chaotic in a fun way. But beneath that surface, there was structure being carefully maintained. Carson had to balance her unpredictability with the demands of live television, ensuring the conversation remained coherent while still letting her personality shine. Number 6. Orson Welles. Orson Welles was never just a guest, he was an event. From the moment he entered a room, his presence felt larger than the space itself. Known for his groundbreaking work in cinema and his unmatched storytelling ability, he carried the aura of a man who had already shaped history. To audiences, he was a genius. To those sitting across from him, he was something far more overwhelming. By the time Welles appeared on late-night television, his life had already evolved far beyond the young prodigy who created cinematic revolutions. He had become a figure of immense physical and vocal presence, calm, deliberate, and commanding in every movement. Even before he spoke, the atmosphere around him changed. As he sat across from Johnny Carson, the usual structure of conversation felt different. Welles didn't rush into answers. He paused, thought, and then delivered responses with a deep, theatrical weight that made every sentence feel important. Carson, experienced with countless personalities, had to adjust his rhythm to match that slow, powerful cadence. Welles had a natural habit of drawing attention, not through volume, but through gravity. When he leaned slightly forward or emphasized a point, the entire focus of the studio shifted toward him. It wasn't intimidation in a loud sense, it was intellectual dominance. Carson remained composed, but he had to carefully pace the interview to avoid being pulled entirely into Welles's world. The audience saw elegance, wisdom, and cinematic authority. What they didn't see was the subtle effort required to maintain balance. Carson had to ensure the conversation stayed structured, gently steering it whenever Welles drifted into long, elaborate reflections that could easily take over the segment. There was also an undeniable physical presence to Welles, his size, his posture, the way he occupied space naturally. It created a closeness that made every interaction feel more intense than expected. Number 7. Truman Capote. Truman Capote was the kind of guest who could turn a simple conversation into something sharp, intimate, and unpredictable. He was already a literary legend, known for his brilliant mind, elegant language, and ability to expose human nature with almost surgical precision. On television, he wasn't just speaking, he was performing intellect itself. When Capote entered the studio, there was a noticeable shift in tone. He carried himself with confidence, often playful, sometimes dramatic, always aware of the attention he commanded. His voice had a distinct rhythm, soft at times, piercing at others, pulling listeners into whatever story he chose to tell. The audience expected wit, gossip, and insight, and Capote rarely disappointed, but as the years went on, there was a visible change in his presence. His energy felt less controlled, his pauses longer, and his focus occasionally drifting mid-conversation. It wasn't a loss of intelligence, his mind was still sharp, but there was an instability in how he delivered it. The performance remained, but the structure around it had weakened. Sitting across from Johnny Carson, Capote often leaned into the conversation in a very personal way. He didn't treat interviews as formal exchanges, he treated them like storytelling sessions with an audience watching closely. That made things compelling, but also difficult to guide. Carson had to carefully balance freedom with structure, allowing Capote to speak while ensuring the segment stayed grounded. Capote's closeness during conversation, physically leaning in, lowering his voice, drawing the host into his world, created an intensity that required full attention. Carson responded with calm professionalism, nodding, listening, and gently steering the discussion when it began to drift too far from its path. It was a quiet form of control, never visible, but always necessary. What the audience saw was charm and intellect at work. Number 8. John Wayne. John Wayne was not just an actor, he was a symbol. To millions, he represented strength, courage, and the classic image of American heroism. His voice alone carried authority, and his presence on screen defined an entire era of Western cinema. Even when he entered a room, there was an immediate sense of respect, as if a living legend had arrived. By the time he appeared on late-night television, Wayne was already more than a star, he was an institution. He carried himself with calm confidence, speaking in that deep, unmistakable tone that made every word feel final and deliberate. The audience admired him not just for his roles, but for the identity he had built over decades. As he sat across from Johnny Carson, the conversation carried a different weight. This wasn't just entertainment, it felt like witnessing history in real time. Carson approached the interview with clear respect, carefully choosing his words and pacing the dialogue to match Wayne's steady rhythm. Unlike more unpredictable guests, Wayne's presence was grounded and controlled. He didn't rush, didn't exaggerate, and didn't seek attention. Instead, he spoke with simplicity and confidence, often sharing stories from Hollywood's earlier days. Each story felt like a fragment of a larger legacy, carefully preserved through memory and experience, but beneath the strong exterior, there was also a visible reality of time and wear. Wayne's later appearances carried a quieter tone, a reminder that even the strongest figures are shaped by age and circumstance. Carson handled this with sensitivity, never pushing too hard, allowing Wayne to guide the conversation at his own pace. The audience saw admiration reflected in every moment. There was no chaos, no unpredictability, only respect between two professionals from different sides of entertainment.